So I was catching up with a work colleague, and he mentioned he's achieved all of his big goals. He's in the middle of his life, and now he's wondering what's next. Does he just keep on working for the rest of his life? What's meaningful? And he was looking to religion, and he posed this question. He said, there's so many religions and so many wise people claiming that theirs is the true one. How can you ever possibly know which one's right? I wonder if you've considered that question or been asked that question. In this talk, I'd like to explore this question with you, and if we can look to the next slide. This is what we're going to cover. We're going to understand the questioner. We're going to try and understand the questioner. We're going to have a look at what's really going on with this question in itself, and then look at how do we narrow down the options for which religion is true. So if we can go to the next slide. Well, we have family members and friends, and they may be following different religions, and that was certainly the case with my work colleague. There's a tug to want to join whatever religion they have. There's a lot of people and a lot of religions in the world, so there's all of these voices, right? And you kind of, if you recall being at school, there may be two captains of the teams, and then like you've got thousands of friends out there, and you're like, and you kind of, and they're all yelling, you know, pick me to be on your team, pick me. Right? It's this big thing. It can be overwhelming. When we have all of these voices and we go, well, maybe I should just try out all of the religions. Well, given that we've got so many to try, we really just don't have enough time to do that. The next point here, just looking at some of the truths in them, recently, like just a couple of nights ago, I was sitting around a fire with a few blokes. One of those was about 80 years old. And he had some understanding of Christianity, but he also had taken some time to explore some Eastern religions like Buddhism. And he said, actually, there seems to be some pretty good stuff in Buddhism. So how do you know? It's not like Christianity is the only one with any truth in them. Like there's all these other options as well that kind of seem reasonable. And then there's another part, which is there's some cultural ideas out there which say things like, well, you can never really know which religion's true, or they're basically all the same. Sometimes they say, well, you're actually arrogant or narrow-minded if you claim that yours is the only true one. And there's another factor which may not be immediately obvious, and that's not an intellectual one, but more of a volitional challenge. And that is that we might not want there to be a true religion, because that means that then we might have to be held accountable morally or to the doctrines of that religion, and that could be uncomfortable. So I think there's a fair bit going on with this question, right? It's a fairly big question, and there's certainly some difficulty in going about how do we find answers to the question. And to be completely honest, there's a fair bit of work for the questioner. If they want to get come to a thorough conclusion about this, they have to put a bit of work in. However, as we go through, I'm hoping that what I can share will give a way forward for someone asking this question. So we can move to the next slide. Let's ask, what's really going on if we look a little bit deeper at the question? What kind of a question is it? What kind of confidence can we have in an answer to this one? Well, I think in one sense, it's a bit like asking who should be convicted for a particular crime when there are lots of suspects. Is that the kind of a question you could answer in just a few minutes? Generally not, right? You're going to have to do a bit of investigation. It's not like a question like, well, what's 2 + 2? Or at what temperature does water boil, right? In those kinds of questions, we can count, we can use observation, and we can easily say, well, okay, consistently at sea level, water's going to boil at 100 degrees. Well, that's something we can easily knock off. And so we can use the scientific method for those kinds of questions, but perhaps that's not something we can do so much with this question of which religion is true. So this does bring up another question. If we go to the next slide. And that question is, why should anyone believe anything at all? There was an author and speaker called James Sire, and he went and talked at a bunch of different universities, and he ran a seminar called exactly this: why should anyone believe anything at all? And what he found was, when he asked people, why do you believe something, their answers, regardless of what they gave, would fit into one of 4 categories: sociological, psychological, religious, and philosophical. And so my question to you is if we consider, say, the sociological reasons, sometimes people believe things because their parents told them. So in and of itself, by itself, if that's the only reason that you believe something, is it a good reason? Well, no, because our parents can get things wrong sometimes, right? If that's the only reason that we believe it. What if we have a look at what culture tells us? Sometimes culture tells us something. Is that a good reason by itself? Well, no, because the Nazis had a culture of saying it's okay to just kill Jews. Clearly, there's some problems with that. How about psychological reasons? What if something brings me comfort? Sometimes it might bring us comfort to believe in God. But also, something else that might bring us comfort is the use of drugs, okay? And the use of drugs can lead to death, right, if they're abused. And so psychological reasons by themselves is not a good reason. What about religious? What if your pastor tells you, or some kind of a scripture, like the Quran or the Bible? Is that a good reason to believe? Well, the problem is everybody's yelling out, well, mine's the right one. So then we need something else, right? We need something else to help us decide between the religious reasons. And so what if we look at the last category, philosophical reasons, which is really about using evidence and reason? Is something worth believing if it's supported by evidence, if it's the best explanation of all the data? It is, and the interesting thing is if you look at the other categories, and they are supported by this 4th category, we've got some. So if your parents say something, but they've got some good reasons, we've got some good evidence to support that, well, now that enhances our confidence that that thing is true, right? So from my own experience as a software engineer, sometimes we need to find a solution that we have not built ourselves. We haven't created the code ourselves, but we need some software that some other vendors have already created, and we need to decide which one to go with. And they may all claim to meet the needs that we have. And my question is, well, will your solution solve my problem? And the answer is, it depends. How did they get their belief that their solution is going to meet my problems? And if they said, well, my parents thought it was a good idea, or my friends thought it was a good idea, okay, or maybe they had a recommendation from, maybe it made them feel happy. It's like, well, if you use my solution, it'll make me feel happy. That's not a good reason, is it? And then what if it was actually recommended by some other professional software developer? But there's lots of other professional developers recommending their different products too, right? But then what if someone actually started to test the solutions? So, okay, I want to see some evidence. I want to see what's the criteria of the solution and what's the criteria of my problem. Are they matching up with the criteria? And what is the outcome when we actually start using those solutions? Now we start to get a better confidence. So that's all very well. But what about when it comes to religions? Maybe we can move to the next slide now. How do we narrow down the options? So first of all, I just want to ask the question, can we find answers to all of our questions to do with religion, all the big questions of life? There's actually a book written that addresses that exact question, and up front, the author, if you're interested, it's called Grand Central Question, and it's written by an ex-Muslim, but he acknowledges that there's just too many questions. We won't be able to answer all of them. But what we can do is we can look at the key questions that every major religion tries to address, okay? And then so we can we can have a look at those major questions and apply the fourth category to look at those. There's some help we can get from a cold case detective called J. Warner Wallace. And he talks about how do we convict someone of a crime. He says we might have some suspects and there might be some evidence pointing towards some of the different suspects. But does that mean before we convict someone that we need to go and evaluate every person in the community? Well, no, we don't need to evaluate every person in the community. What we need is some enough evidence that convinces us beyond a reasonable doubt that this particular person is guilty. And it's the same with religions. So what we can do, if we move to the next slide, is we can ask some key questions. We won't be able to answer all of them because there are too many. But for any given religion, we can look at the fourth category that we were talking about, and we can ask questions like, what kind of explanatory power does this religion provide us? Is it logically consistent? Are there internal contradictions? Is it coherent? So does it make sense when we think about all of the elements of it? And so maybe just as an example of what we might, how that might look, is if we look at, say, Hinduism. Because, for example, there's some issues where religions claim things that are contradictory. So I could say to you, I know a 20-year-old who has a 10-year-old biological mother. Well, clearly that doesn't make any sense at all, right? But the thing is that sometimes religions make similar claims, and Hinduism here's an example of Hinduism making a claim like this. It teaches that our individual identities are part of a large divine illusion called Maya. And let me ask you a question. Does an individual need to exist in order to have knowledge? I would think yes, right? They need to exist in order to have knowledge. But if the individual does not really exist because they're part of an illusion, then how can they actually have the knowledge that they're part of an illusion? They need to exist first. And so clearly when that doesn't make sense, we can say, okay, well, is this a small thing or is this a big thing that we're talking about? Well, this is talking about the nature of reality, and it's talking about the nature of God. And if they're confused on this fundamental point, that's a big cross to that particular religion. So we can apply the fourth category to any kind of religion, and we can think about things critically and logically, and some of these things are ruled out. So we can ask some key questions. We can look at the fourth category at any religion, and then we can also ask some other fundamental questions like, does God exist? If he does, then we can rule out atheism, okay? If he doesn't, then we can rule out Christianity, Judaism, other theistic religions. But that's a fundamental question that has a lot of flow-on effects. So we can have, does God exist? Then we can have a look at Jesus. The reason why looking at Jesus is a good idea is because most religions acknowledge this or recognize him in some way. So it would make a lot of sense to start with Jesus, look at what his claims are, what his life was like, and see if his claims are credible. So there's the framework. We've got a question of which religion is true. Okay, it's a big question, and we've seen that there's some better and worse things to base our beliefs on. But we can look at the fourth category to evaluate religions, and we can use some key questions to narrow down our options. So personally, I think the smart money is on Jesus. I think he's got the right take on the world. And in another talk, in just a bit, I'll take a look at some of the evidence that supports his view of the world. So right now, if anyone's got any questions, happy to just see if anyone has some questions. We can have a bit of a chat back and forth. So I'll just open it up now if anyone has any questions.
that acknowledges Jesus?
Yeah, sure. So there's a number, but ones that come to mind might be Baha'i. So they talk about having multiple enlightened individuals through time, that they say, oh, look, this person is an enlightened individual, and they count Jesus as one of those. So look, he was a very wise person, and so that's how they incorporate him into their view of the world. He's just one of many enlightened individuals. Yeah, you just mentioned Islam also acknowledge Jesus. Yeah.
Oh. Okay, so with your example with Hinduism, and there being one point that can help us cross that off the list, many religions have denominations or sects within the religion that differentiate beliefs. So would you feel confident crossing one off the list for over one topic? Do you feel like you would need to actually look into several different topics because of those different versions of the same faith where they might not agree within themselves about that?
Yeah, that's great question, which kind of comes back to what the book I was talking about, Grand Central Question, just says, look, there's just way too many variants of all the religions. We'll never be able to answer all of those questions. But if we think about what kinds of questions that worldviews answer, they look at the big questions like, where did we come from? What's wrong with the world? What's the meaning of life? What's the nature of God, if he exists or not? What's our purpose? What's our meaning? So, people might have disagreements about whether I sprinkle or I fully immerse someone. That's kind of one of the smaller kinds of questions. Might be important to figure that out for you, but as far as a big consequential thing, we want to look at those core kinds of questions to give us some kind of way to make progress with this question, right? So I think you're absolutely right. I just gave an example of something we can cross off. With Hinduism, just talking about one of those big ones, the nature of God, the nature of reality. But we'd probably also, to be fair, want to have a look at some of those other big questions that are answers and compare those with the other religions we've considered as well.
One of the core questions that you're stating that is commonly asked is, does God exist? So my question is, and it might be premature in that it might be relating to your second talk, but one of the questions that I think that I've asked, well, I know that I've asked and that many other people ask is, how interested is God in our existence? How interested is God in us? How personal is this God?
Yeah, so interesting. This same book, this is, I feel like we could take a long time unpacking this, but let me just mention briefly one of the things that Abdul Murray, who wrote this book, Grand Central Question, talks about, is one of the differences between Islam and Christianity. And he says, Christianity talks about having a triune God, right? And it talks about the Trinity, whereas Islam talks about having no God but one. It's Allah. And one of the things that he points out as a difference is that sometimes Muslims see this as a weakness of Christianity, but it turns out that Christianity has, because they can kind of say, look, it's a contradiction. How does that even make sense? 1 + 1 + 1 doesn't equal 3, right? It doesn't equal 1, it equals 3. So there's this apparent logical inconsistency, which I won't fully go into yet, but it turns out that having 3 in 1 turns out to be a real positive strength, right? In that, since the nature of God is love, what does it mean to have love or to express it if you are by yourself? If there's 3 in 1, then the Holy Spirit, Jesus and God the Father, can eternally express love and have love between one and each other, right? So the interesting thing about this is God, sometimes people say, well, God created people because he is love and he needed to express that love towards people. But what's actually going on here is if we've got Jesus, Holy Spirit, and God the Father coexisting eternally and sharing love with each other, actually he doesn't need humans. He doesn't need humans to express that love because he's already got that in the Trinity. So that asks the question, why did he create humans? Because he thought it was a good thing. Because he wanted to. Not out of need, but because he desired it. And I think that speaks a lot to the value of humans that God has for them. So I thought this was a beautiful thing. I wanted to create them. So that's something I'd share, yeah.
Okay, you just kind of answered the question that was thrown at me one time by one of my art students. And she asked me, and she described God's internalness. She knew well the scriptures. She had a conversation with her sister, and they were saying how if God is so incomplete and he is so perfect, within himself, why did he want to or need to create people to worship him? He must have been terribly insecure. And so it's one of those questions that you're not often asked, that kind of thing. I can't repeat it the way she spoke, did ask it. But she'd obviously been deeply thinking about it. But as you said, God didn't need, the only way I could answer it is, well, God didn't need it because he's insecure and needs and wants worship. He did it for us because he had love and he wanted to bless us. So he created us so that he could bless others and spread his blessing. So that's the only way I could answer it. I've thought of other ways of answering it since then. But what you just said a moment ago kind of did answer that. Yeah, thank you.
Well, I think that might be a good point to move on to the next talk. And the next talk is called I'm Not Dead Yet. So maybe while Lucas brings that up, there were some ants walking along the pavement and suddenly they got trapped and they were being burned alive as they were stuck in the sunlight that had been intensified by a magnifying glass that my teenage friend was using. And in a number of ways, this talk looks at the similarities between humans and those ants. We're on one part of the pavement. Everything was fine for the ant's life, but when the conditions changed, such as the warmth of the sun, which is usually 100% suitable for life, when it was increased, it could change to become highly prohibitive to life. And maybe the comparison is a little bit extreme, but I think it's enough to illustrate the broader point. And before I kind of get into that a bit more, maybe we can move to the next slide, Lucas. I want to take a step back for a second. And what I want to look at in this talk is the evidence for the existence of God. So there are many lines of evidence and lots of arguments for the existence of God, such as the cosmological argument, the moral argument, the teleological or design argument for God. And in this particular case, I want to look at the design argument, one of them called the anthropic principle. So if we can, and these are the things we're going to cover in the talk. Maybe we can move to the next slide. And the design argument roughly goes like this. Premise 1, every design has a designer. Premise 2, the universe has a highly complex design, and therefore the conclusion, therefore the universe has a designer. So just like the idea that a watch doesn't just happen to exist by itself, it doesn't just occur by chance or natural forces. You know, if we were walking through a forest and we saw a watch, we wouldn't just go, oh, that's just something out of nature. We'd go, hang on a second, there's some design there. It requires some intelligent intentionality for that to come into existence. So it's the second premise here. The universe has highly complex design that I want to look at now by considering the anthropic principle. And the title of this talk, I'm Not Dead Yet. For those who are not aware, it's a reference to a Monty Python movie. It's just the thing that comes to mind for me when I think about the anthropic principle, which is basically the idea that we need the right kinds of conditions for human life to exist. And if they weren't right, we wouldn't exist. And in particular, if they only changed just very minutely, we wouldn't exist. So it's this fine-tuning that implies the need for a designer. So what are the kinds of conditions we're talking about? Maybe we can move to the next slide. Oh yeah, and again. What kinds of conditions? Well, it becomes a bit more obvious when we consider the opposite, which very recently, as in just within this last week, there's been some astronauts stuck in a space station. Don't know if people are aware of that. And so there's concerns about them getting back to Earth safely. Now, why would anyone be concerned about that? Well, because space is not very suitable for life. There's no oxygen there. There's less gravity, which means human muscles, including the heart, can waste away because they don't have the same resistance that they have here on Earth. So in order to travel out there, there's a whole bunch of things we don't normally have on Earth that they have to consider. So there's a whole bunch of anthropic constants, conditions that we have that need to be in place for human life to exist. So the first one, we're just going to look at a handful here. The oxygen level on Earth normally is 21%, right? So of the gases in the atmosphere. And if we were to increase that to 25%, say, then we could have fires spontaneously erupting. But if it was less than that, if it was, say, 15%, then human beings would suffocate. Constant number 2, atmospheric transparency. If it was less transparent, and this is talking about sunlight coming to Earth, if it was less transparent, then we wouldn't get enough solar radiation reaching the Earth's surface. And if it was more transparent, we would be bombarded with too much, just like the ants. Constant number 3, the Moon-Earth gravitational interaction. If it was greater than it currently is, then tidal effects on the ocean's atmosphere and rotational period would be too severe. And if it was less, then orbital changes would cause climatic instabilities. Either way, life on Earth would be impossible. Constant number 4, carbon dioxide level. If it were higher than it is now, plants would not be able to maintain efficient photosynthesis. We'd basically all suffocate. And constant number 5 is gravity. If its force was altered by 0.00000, like 37 of those zeros, and then 1%, our sun would not exist, and therefore neither would we. That's some precision, isn't it? So here's the thing. Those are just 5 constants, but there are well over 100 of these very narrowly defined constants, and they strongly point to an intelligent designer. Small change in one might affect others and could prevent or destroy the conditions necessary for life. So they're not just a few broadly defined constants. They're not just constants that could have resulted by chance. No, the extent of the fine-tuning here is quite a powerful argument for the existence of God. There's an astrophysicist named Hugh Ross who calculated the probability of 122 of these constants that would exist for any planet in the universe by chance. His answer is staggering. Just keep in mind here that it's estimated that there's 10 to the power of 70 atoms in the entire universe? His answer says there would be one chance in 10 to the 138. So that's one chance in 1 with 138 zeros after it, which essentially means there's zero chance that any planet would have life-supporting conditions like we have unless there was a watchmaker, an intelligent designer behind everything. So if we can move to the next slide and the one after it. Some atheists might respond to this. A common objection or way for them to explain this is well, they talk about the multiverse. And they say, well, that's fine. But what if actually there was an infinite number of universes? And if that was the case, then of course one of them would have exactly the conditions that ours have, right? Okay, but there's a number of problems with that. I'm going to mention 2 of them. And some of you that were listening to my first talk might have already seen the first problem. Let's talk about that 4th column. Do we have any evidence for a multiverse? No evidence. 0 evidence for a multiverse. So that's a massive problem. And the second thing is that in order for there to be a whole bunch of universes started, seems like we would need some kind of intelligence to get that started. We'd need a designer again. So in the end, what do we have? Can we move to the next slide, please? We're just going to revisit this design argument. Premise 1, every design has a designer. Premise 2, as verified by the I'm not dead yet anthropic principle, we know beyond a reasonable doubt that the universe is designed because of its fine tuning, and therefore, our conclusion, the universe has a designer. And for my money, that designer is someone we call God. So that brings us to the end of the talk, and happy to have any questions if there are any. Otherwise, we can leave it there. Yes.
You said earlier that does God exist? Why do you think people don't ask that question? Because I've interacted with a lot of people and they say, I don't want to talk about it, or I'm not interested. How can you not be interested in that question?
It's super interesting. I'd have to give that a bit of thought, but I entirely resonate because I kind of feel like there's people at different stages in their lives will be more or less interested in that question. Classic. You've got a theory, yeah. Yeah. So I think what you're saying, just to repeat for the recording, you're just saying you've got a theory, and that is that people have to deal with the answer. So, and that kind of ties back a little bit to the first talk when people ask the question, one of the things that comes up is not just intellectual objections, but volitional objections. They don't like the idea of what that means. They have to be accountable to somebody. What their actions actually matter. And the interesting thing is that even if people don't acknowledge that their actions matter, some people have this idea of whatever's true for you is true for you, and whatever's true for me is true for me. And it's kind of like just live and let live, in this idea of moral relativism. But when the rubber hits the road and you start doing things that violate their standard of morality, then suddenly they're not so relative about things. And so if you start lying to them, particularly about their money or about how you're going to treat them, suddenly they they think, oh, it's not just what's true for you and what's true for me. It's like, I want you to abide by my rules now. I want my rules to apply to everybody. And so I think in a similar way, when people start to think about, does this matter or not? Does truth matter or not? It does become apparent. I mean, just in a religious sense as well, right? We can say, well, who cares which religion's true? Does it really matter? And we can ask the millions of people that Mother Teresa impacted in India. You know, Hinduism has a caste system which says all the scum or lower end of society kind of deserve to be there, and so that's part of their karma, and they should just stay there. Right? That's the outworking of a particular religion, whereas Mother Teresa's religion is very different in saying there's people suffering, and it's my responsibility, my obligation as another human being made in the image of God. They deserve help. So does it matter? Yeah, it matters. It matters to millions of people. So sometimes people are just not in that place, or they haven't thought it through. There's definitely an impact here based on the decisions we make, yeah.
From a medical term, you know, I'm going so that people don't really know, our whole human body has to have a designer, an architect that has gotten right down to the smallest molecule in our body, and yet people won't believe that we are created in God's image, yet you can't put a building up without the architect drawing the thing and, you know, like getting the builders to build it, and yet people go, oh no, we just come from slime. And I go, okay, so.
Yeah, that is a whole nother topic, which is about design within the human body and biology. 100% agree with you that the complexity of it certainly screams out designer. But I'll probably just leave that there for the moment.
I'm just to endorse what's already been said, that basically people don't want to know about God because they don't want to be accountable for their actions. So they don't want to have to face what they've done. They want to be able to live their life without having to give or being accountable for what they've done.
Those questions, is there a God? And if they, through a process of philosophical processing and logic, and they reach the conclusion that yes, there has to be a intelligent designer, and if they process that further and look at the multitude of claims on how one can connect with God, and they arrive at the point of personally realising that Christ Jesus is the only way to connect with God, yet that person has come from a place of deep brokenness and has lived a life that's as far from God as one could be. How could that person, with any degree of confidence, come and connect with God?
That is a great question. And there could be a whole bunch of talks that we can talk about, all of the, about the life of Jesus, about the historical evidence for what he did in his life, and far too much to cover right now. But what I would say is that for someone to have evaluated the knowledge, evaluated all those things, they've looked at the evidence, they've come to the conclusion, yes, it seems very logical that God exists, but I've done all of these terrible things, or I feel like I'm not worthy. Then we look at Jesus' teachings, and he actually says, this is exactly why he came. This is exactly why he came to earth, which is because we can't by ourselves we can't measure up. And that's exactly why and the fact that we can't do that means that we are separated from God, which is what Jesus came to do. He said, I fully understand that, and I know that you won't be able to save yourself from this state that you're talking about, but that's why I've come and died on the cross and taken that penalty, and then I've risen from the dead. There's a whole talk we can do on the evidences for Jesus rising from the dead. But what does that mean? That signifies the fact that he's conquered death, he's conquered sin, and we can have freedom, we can have a relationship with God, we can be restored. So to that, I would say, absolutely, that's why Jesus came, which is then made the way for you and I, who are not perfect, to be able to have a relationship with God. So
this probably relates more to the first talk, but how would you respond to someone who says, why do I need to work this out now? Why don't I just wait till I die, and then if God is there, he can tell me what the answer is from whatever religion he is there from, and we can work it out when I get to that point.
Yeah, interesting. I suppose maybe as an analogy you could ask, well, there's two kinds of analogies that come to mind. One is, I think I probably need to work on this, right? But I think of it as a shopping sale. Like there's a sale that the shop has put on the sale, and for a limited time, you can take advantage of their 25%, 50% off, whatever it is. And you can choose to engage with that, and you can choose to take advantage of the opportunity. But if you don't, that gets pulled away, and you miss out, basically. And in some sense, it's the same in life, where we all, at some point, we're going to die. But the thing is, I can't choose the terms of the sale. That's up to the shopkeeper. They decide what the terms are of the offer that's there. And so kind of the question, I think, has this idea of maybe I'm the one that gets to decide how things work. But maybe it's not the case that you get to decide. And that actually, if God does exist, and he's the one that's responsible for the universe being created and how life works, and if Jesus is who he said he is, then it's the thing where we have to acknowledge that we don't actually get to set the rules. We don't get to say how things work. We have to follow the evidence, use that fourth column. We have to follow what is actually true, and it's us that needs to kind of then conform to that or work with it, because otherwise there's impacts. We don't get to decide what happens after we die. And so it's actually up to how things actually are. And to my understanding is that we will be responsible to one God, and that's the God of the Bible. So that's what I would say to that.
If you've got time for one more question.
Yeah.
When you were talking about what is it called, the anthropic question?
I'm not dead yet.
Yes, that question.
Anthropic principle, yeah.
So you explained it with the probability and the likelihood of things happening, and I just want to counter that by saying that just because things are very, very difficult doesn't mean they're not possible. And I would use the example of pregnancy is actually very unlikely if you look at it, but then obviously there's lots of people on the earth. So just because it's very difficult doesn't mean it's impossible. How would you look at those things that you've talked about today without just going, well, it's very hard, so it can't be possible?
Yeah, really, really good question, totally valid. And that's the response lots of people have. So with any of the arguments for the existence of God, and we can look at any of them, there are challenges that come back. The question we have to ask ourselves is, does that actually change the evidence that we have that is positive for the existence of God? There might be some rejoinders, there might be some counters that go, oh yeah, but at the end of the day, you can say, but is this still a solid argument for God's existence? Does it have merit by itself? And when we look at the probability, we go, well, this is not just a 1 in 10 chance. It's not just a 1 in 100. It's not a 1 in 1,000. It's one with 138 zeros on the end of it. So you say, is it absolutely zero? Well, no, not absolutely zero, but kind of, yeah. This is a pretty strong argument. So in and of itself, yep, you could say, oh, it's still possible. But really? Not really. Like, you've got to make an assessment there for yourself and go, oh, what's the strength of this argument? And so that's what I'd say, yeah. So cool. If there's no other questions, I might hand over to Pastor Richard.